What's going on, people? Welcome to another video. We have Carrot Corner Pro and Coach and Discord Sensei, one of the people handing out the gems of knowledge in the Discord server. James Shea joining us today. James is going to be running a seminar course called The Fortress on Carrot Corner very soon. That's starting on the 15th of November. So I thought I'd get him on the channel and basically, James, I want you to talk a bit today about how you went from this graph here to this graph here. This is quite a remarkable change in your journey from struggling Break Even Reg to coach, and obviously really clearly talented and knowledgeable poker player has been quite an extreme one. So what did you fix? Like, how did you go from the first graph here to the second one?
First off, thanks for having me on the show. I've done a few streams for you like a long time ago, but I've never been on the show, but I've been around and been listening to your content for a long time. So really glad to be here, really glad to bring the course to you. I think one thing with the course that I really want to get across is like I spent a really long time as like a break-even losing player. I've been playing for 20 years now. I started when I was a little kid. I was like 12 years old when I first started. And I heard all these stories about people who'd been playing for like 2-3 years and they'd started to see some success. And I never really saw that on my own game. I studied like really hard for a really long time. Like I said, this graph's from like 2017. So I'd probably been playing for about 15 years and I was still, break even over what this is like 300,000 hands. And I'd studied hard. Like I felt like I was a really good player. I felt like I knew as much as, the kind of 100, 200 and now regs that I'd be talking to and just still be breaking even at 25 and now probably losing at 50. So there was obviously some sort of secret sauce that I didn't have that I couldn't work out. So the real kind of motivation behind the course is trying to make sure that people don't have that kind of same experience, that they can, if they're like willing to put the work in like I was and willing to kind of work hard. These are the things that you need to work hard at to actually move from a break-even to a winning player rather than acquiring a ton of knowledge, but still not actually improving your game practically. So if I had to kind of narrow it down to 2 or 3 things, I think the first thing was that I think there's a lot of bad advice out there. There's a lot of people who talk about how they think you should play against fish, what they think the pool's kind of tendencies are. The truth is, if you get 2 regs who are completely equal in skill, but when they don't know what to do, one defaults to being too aggressive and the other guy defaults to being too passive. One of them is just going to be way more successful than the other, depending on what pool you put them in, right? If you put them in a pool where people fold too much, the aggressive guy is going to have a field day. If you put them into, a pool where people call too much, then the passive guy is probably going to do a lot better. And I think there's a lot of kind of bad advice out there about how to kind of what the exploits are and so on. And the truth is, if you could do much better or much worse than people who are equal skill than you if you just have the right tendencies. So the first thing is to kind of remove people's biases. If your biases are kind of pointing in the wrong direction, you want them to be pointing in the right direction and giving people some kind of clarity on that and saying this is the actual truth. Because like I said, I think there's a lot of bad advice out there and there has been for a long time.
Yeah. And I think with the Fortress, like one of the ideas is that we're going to look at how to solidify things. It's like brick by brick. We're looking at some really common spots, especially like early on in the game tree. So if you're thinking about joining the seminar course, it's the 15th of November. What you should really expect from that would be coverage of situations that people are like miles away from a solid strategy, right? And like you're showing in that course how people can get closer to something that's game theory approved, but that's not really why we're trying to do it, right? The game theory is like a good sort of benchmark, maybe something to aspire to, something to get vague ideas from. But I think in reality, we're looking to find defense strategies when we're facing aggression in common spots that are like more in sync with something solid because they are better against humans as well. So maybe you could speak a little bit to what are your thoughts on people who study really rigorously with solvers and GTO? Did you do a lot of that? At what point does that go too far? And what were the more sort of exploitative things that you began learning that really turned the tide and moved you from the first graph here to the second one?
Yeah, and this is the second point really. I think the way that I use solvers is more from like a leak, at least for the most part, is finding leaks and kind of getting rid of them. And a lot of that is just from like a frequency point of view. Like some people, you'll see they're check raising too much versus c-bets. Some people are folding too much versus c-bets. And in kind of all the coaching that I've received or that I have received in the past, less so recently, a lot of it was, you talk about hand history. The guy would say, oh, I think you should have raised this turn. And you go, okay then, and kind of move on. And you don't actually become a kind of better player from it.
And you had a lot of coaches, right, before you actually came to me. Yeah. Like before I taught you, I remember you saying that you were on like I was like your 5th or 6th coach that you got or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So I'd kind of been through the mill a few times. done the same thing. Had some guy just be like, I remember there was one coach who said, if someone's like a really good player, you just need to shell up and play GTO. And I was like, so how do I do that? And he didn't really have any answers. This is where I kind of, a lot of what my approach comes from is all the issues that I've got with the industry and the way people coach, and trying to make, kind of correct those things. So talking about solvers, I think if you look at, I remember when I first got solve, if you look at a solve, it's far too complicated. It's really, really hard to get an idea of what's going on. If you just want to look at a c-bet strategy and you look at it and you see, okay, everything's a mix. There's no pure actions with any hand. Like, what do I do with that? That was kind of my first experience with solvers. And so what I think I do now, which I'm bringing to the course, is look at it again from a kind of frequency point of view. What are my mistakes? How often is the solver folding here versus how often am I folding here? And how can I build a human playable strategy based on what the solver's doing? So taking all that complex, everything's a mix, and turning it into something that as a human you can actually play. And again, I think like all of your personal biases play into that. So for example, there's certain spots where against a check raise, I might be over defending and I need to dial it back a little bit. So understanding I'm over defending, what sort of hands am I over defending? I just need to drop a few from the bottom. That's quite an easy thing to do. Whereas if you look at it from the point of view of how do I defend against check raises, let's look at what the solver does, and there's just a ton of mixing with everything, that becomes quite difficult. So there's a bit of focus in the course on how to simplify what the solver's doing to something that like a human can actually play. Doing it in a way that's incentivized so that generally exploits what the pool are doing rather than gets exploited. And then some focus on hand selection, making sure that you're not making EV mistakes. And that hand selection is how can I select the right hands in a human way rather than this hand is mixing 5% of the time, this is doing it 20% of the time, this is 30, and just getting kind of lost in the sauce.
And how about exploits? Like, at what point did you realize that you had to start maybe taking lines that were better against the pool that you were playing in? You mentioned that like different pools call for different sorts of exploits. So how did you find the right exploits for the pool that you were playing in? And can you give us some like a couple of examples of like things that you started doing and maybe a couple of nodes that were like really effective? Can we give people some secret sauce here? As you say, what were a couple of examples of that where deviating from the GTO strategy was actually really important for win rate?
So the first one was like my biases were just like far too tight, far too passive, scared to bluff, scared to value bet, all those sorts of things. Back when I was, 25 and I'll break even. I remember one hand, like really for some reason quite vividly, and there was kind of a tight player, really, really basic hand. I opened the button, I c-bet flop, c-bet turn, and then bluffed the river. And I remember like bristling and being all excited when he folded, and it was like a really big thing that I'd like triple barreled this guy because like I had a perception that, bluffing just wasn't a very good thing to do. People were a little bit too tight. And so just removing the biases from, I kind of heard the way to beat low stakes is to play ABC and really face up and everything like that, and kind of removing that bias, realizing that people in general do tend to overfold, and I can actually start defaulting to bluffing a little bit more often rather than defaulting to giving up with all the bluffs. So I think that's one that made a big difference. And once you've got certainty on it, once someone tells you, like this is a good thing to do, this should be your default, it kind of lifts the shackles a little bit rather than every single time you're in the spot being like, oh, I don't know what to do. And then your bias is setting in. If you're on a downswing, you're always going to default back to those kind of incorrect biases. Just removing those shackles means that you can kind of execute no matter what sort of situation you're in. If you're 100%, if you're 50%, if you're sick, whatever.
Yeah, so most of the stuff in the Fortress is about facing aggression, but there's also some cases where we work on being a bit more accurate with river play and turn aggression and stuff like that as well. So I think it's a really cool course that covers a lot of different, very common and important spots for your win rate. I'll just briefly show people what that looks like on Carrot Corner and how to sign up just while we're on the topic. And then we'll review a couple of hands that you've brought that you think are kind of in some way demonstrative of some of the things that maybe you fixed in your game to go from graph A to graph B here. For anyone that's interested in this seminar course, it's going to be running via a Discord group that's part of our server that you get a link to when you sign up. There'll be Zoom calls. You can see your pretty face there, James, nicely clean shaven as well to boot, which is always good. Here we have the graphs, and here we have a little video from you sort of explaining what the course is about a bit more. We have some course details, and this is the course outline just showing the different spots that are going to be covered. We have 2-bit pots, 3-bit pots, river play towards the end. So the cost is $499 for 6 seminars. How long are the seminars again?
They'll be an hour and 40 minutes each. There's a chance that they'll end up being closer to 2 hours, but we'll see how it goes.
Quite a high chance, I would say, because with poker coaching, things always seem to drag on. There's always like so much to talk about, right?
Yeah, you probably picked up from today as well. I have a tendency to talk a little bit too much and go into a little bit too much detail, so...
All right, well, let's go over a few hands now. Let's give the audience what they want, a bit of free strategy advice from you, and let's see what you've brought that illustrates how we went from graph A to graph B. Okay, so let's start with this one. We have the ace 10 offsuit here. We are in the big blind. We've flatted the small blind open, which is really normal. The flop is forward deuce 6. It goes check, check. Looks really standard so far. Jack of hearts turn, villain bets really small. I think this is already a node where people may go wrong, or where it looks close, or where these passive biases that you talked about in the past might come in. So how would you have played this spot back in 2017 when we looked at the first graph, and how would you play it today?
Yeah, 2017, it's hard to say. Like, I was a bit of a nit back then. There's a good chance that I would have just been folding or not really known what to do against the small bet. I think one thing that I want to bring with the course a little bit is just kind of overall strategy building. Being able to, we talk about like how to study to some length in the course. And one thing that I think is really good is to have a strategy in a spot, a reasonable strategy. Build that strategy in your study time. And then if you end up having leaks or having mistakes in that spot later on, you can make tweaks to that strategy overall. So here I've got a strategy. There'll be some raising, some calling. I'll have an idea of where that calling threshold is. I think it's a fair bit below ace 10 against the block bet. And if I end up being wrong, if I find I'm defending too much or defending too little in the spot, I can look that up and then realize, okay, I need to change my threshold. So I think having like a fairly pre-built strategy almost is really good. So you're not just trying to work things out in game, and again, letting your biases sink in. That's what I've done in spots like this. So I definitely wouldn't be folding any kind of ace in this spot. I suspect that there'll be quite a fair bit of calling with king high and any kind of draw. We've got quite stable showdown value, so raising doesn't really make much sense to me in this spot. Too thin for value too. But yeah, we're not getting value. We're not getting much worse to fold, much better to fold. So this seems like a straightforward call.
Looks good. I think a lot of people fold here actually because their minimum standard is generated subconsciously. Like, in line with their biases, they're kind of like, well, if I had a gut shot, or if I had a pair, or if I had a flush draw, I would defend. I could defend all my pairs here, but they don't really consciously compute just what happens when the sizing becomes this small and we're getting 4-1. We need 20% pot share to break even by calling here. That's not the same as equity. That's like EV, right? We need 20% of that. And many hands in villain's range here can just be queen high or king high or 10 high or just a random hand or worse ace high. There's just a ton of different stuff that could be doing this. And even if we are behind the likes of a 6 or pocket 7s or something like that, we're going to have a decent amount of redraw as well. So even with our 2 overcards alone, we're coming close to like some equity percentage that we would need. And then the rest comes from just the raw showdown value, having the best hand a decent amount of the time. Then it's probably a little tad of implied odds on the river on certain cards, as we're about to see as well. So yeah, I think a really easy place to be too tight.
Yeah, maybe if you're scared about, I don't want to call the turn and fold the river. If you think the guy's over bluffing, you can just call turn, call river. If you think he's under bluffing, then again, you could be making an exploit by calling turn, folding river. But if this is just a clear defend, you should absolutely be making the call and not worrying about what happens on a later street.
Yeah, we get that a lot where people are saying things like, well, I didn't really want to call here because I knew I was just going to face like another bet. And it's, well, first off, you didn't know that. But if you do think that pool are too aggressive in that spot, as you say, then you have a bluff catcher. To beat a range that's over bluffing, you don't need to have a really good hand. It's not like, God damn it, this guy's over bluffing. If only I had a jack so I could punish him for it. That's playing right into their hands if you think they're playing that way. And MDA, mass data, will point in spots like this where there's been minimal filtering. Pre-flop is a wide range. It's a late configuration. It's going to point towards there being way too many weak combos in villain's range to begin with. Not enough good hands being chosen for this bet size. That's just how humans construct. So our course, grade E of the Carrot Poker School, which is all about MDA, is going to say that this spot is really over bluffed if they bet turn and river. This sort of scattered aggression where they bet 2 streets but not 3 in late position. I don't want to give away the entire course here, but I'll give you this one for free, guys. That's a spot you really want to be quite happy about investing money in. But I think you make a great point that even if you don't know that, even if someone watching this is like, well, I don't have all of that mass data available, I can't afford grade E right now, whatever. Well, the point is that if you know where the theoretical threshold is, you can at least avoid making unnecessary amounts of mistakes, even if you are missing a few of those really juicy exploits. So, like to see the call here. We river the 10, villain block bets again. So why did you decide to bring this hand to the video?
Yeah, I think the most common leak that I see, like when I play, even at like fairly high stakes, I'm sure you can see it at any stake really, but the most common leak that I see is people just not going anywhere near thin enough for value. Like if I'm villain in this spot and I block bet the river, I see people just like snap calling with hands like Jack 9, Jack 8, which is just a huge mistake. So that's why I brought the hand. I think people are missing thin value in bets. I think people are missing thin value in raises as well. Ace 10 in here is just, I think it might be the threshold hand for a raise, but it is a raise in equilibrium. If you think that the pool is a little bit underprotected with this small sizing, if you think they're just not going to be going with this size with a jack ever, with, you know, the sets that they might have slow played from the flop and going for a check raise, then ace 10 has a hell of a lot of equity here and just becomes like a clear raise. I think if you follow the hand from the flop, the guy is probably range checking the flop, or if he's not range checking, he's checking a lot of the time. People will do a lot of checking in these on these low boards and do a lot of check raising. So he absolutely has hands like 9s, 8s, 7s, 6x in his range, and those absolutely can be block betting twice for value, because we can have ace high, we can have a 4, we can have a deuce, and like ace 6 probably isn't even that thin to go for block.
Yeah. So the way I see it is like humans are like sheep in a way, right? Or human thoughts are like sheep. This is a weird analogy, but I'm imagining this like herd of sheep. Like we're like, oh God, we're talking strategy, and Pete's gone off on one of his rants, right? But bear with me. Like you imagine this the herd of sheep running along the field, and then like the herding dog comes out and runs in a specific direction. And most of the sheep go the same way, right? They go through the gate that they're being herded through. Maybe sometimes some sheep go astray and the dog has to like do another circle round and round them up again. So if you imagine that, like, take this analogy to the turn now, villain range checks the flop, you check back, he lands on the turn with the whole herd of sheep. And then which are the sheep that are most prone to go down the block bet route? Like which are the most like intuitive sheep to go into that pen? Well, it's going to be the 7s, the 6x, the pocket 5s, the 4x, the 8s, the 9s, things like that, and some bluffs. It's not going to be king jack or queen jack or pocket kings. That's going to be deeply counterintuitive. So the solver will at some frequency, with certain like really nutted hands, play that way, but the human won't. So I don't even think it's as weak as like a hypothetical of like, if you think they're underprotecting. I think this is a spot where unless the player is really, really balanced and like really solver-esque in their play, they are going to be completely unbalanced towards exactly the 7s and stuff like that. And yeah, their range is meant to shift in that direction, but it's not meant to be quite such an extreme effect in GTO as it probably is here. So what would you say about like understanding the theory of this hand? Like if you think back to like, I know you did Carrot Poker School a couple of years back. So if you think back to like grade 2 of that and the equity tables and estimating your landing equity, do you want to talk a little bit about why that's so important to actually think about how much equity your hand arrives with on a particular street?
Yeah, I guess if you just look at it and go, oh, I have it. Like, I think it's quite easy to just go, I have a 10, I call. Like, this seems like a clear defend. I'm not folding to a block bet here. You just smash the call button. Like I say, I think people just smash the call button with a hand like Jack 8. Whereas if you think about like the guy's range as a whole, I think you can quite heavily discount a Jack. There's a lot of 10x that he can have after blocking the turn and being your turn on the river, as well as all these other weaker pocket pairs and 6x. If you look at it from that point of view, your equity could be pretty close to 100%. No, I don't think we've got 100% here by any means, and people will, you know, block with a hand like Jack 3 and Jack 5, especially if they're like a little bit scared about getting value. But your equity is going to be through the roof, very likely into the 90s. And when you look at it from that point of view, I think it becomes pretty clear. Your decision isn't like, this feels like a very middling call if you don't think about it too much. You just go, this is a really straightforward call. I'm nowhere near raising. I'm nowhere near folding. I'm right in the middle. But if you think about it from like an equity point of view, immediately the ideas of you shift from the folding side of the spectrum to all the way into the raising, and it becomes quite clear that you should be at least considering raising this spot. But if you look at the spot and you go, I think I've got 90% equity, then immediately go, if I've got 90%, I should be raising here, surely.
Right. So just remembering to be that little bit more explicit about how much equity you have. Like, hold on a minute. I think I get here with a hand that is best 8 times out of 10. Yet it's not the case that like villain is totally polar and we're only winning 8 times out of 10 or 9 times out of 10 because they're over bluffing. They might be over bluffing a bit, but the main reason that we're winning that often is that they have the sort of thin value range. Like they're getting here with the hand like 8, so they're hitting a 10 on the river that's worse than our 10 or something like that a very large amount of the time, and that's why raising is so good, because that 90% equity or whatever is made up of actually winning against made hands that can pay off a raise at a decent frequency. Small bets can induce. People are more than fully aware that when they bet small, they may be inducing raises. So you are going to get looked up here by 6x, or maybe that's too thin to block, but like 9s or 10x or something at a decent frequency.
Yeah, and I think this is where like other biases are really, really easy to creep in. I think it's really easy in this spot to look at it and go, oh, like he's never going to call with a 6 or pocket 7s or 8s or anything like that here. But at the same time, when you arrive here with, you know, ace 3 or king 3, go, you don't even consider bluff raising because you're like, oh, this is incredible. He's blocked. He thinks he's going to reduce. He's just going to kind of call me. So I see that as a mistake that a lot of people make as well. They they take both sides. They're like, I can't value bet this spot because of this, but then also I can't bluff this spot. And it's like both these things can't be true. Either he's going to station you sometimes or he's never going to. And if he's going to station you sometimes, you should be raising ace 10. If he's not, you should be raising all of your air. And most people don't do either.
So because I'm like a dinosaur coach and I've been coaching for so long, I have like all these little sayings and adages that get stuck in my head now. And one of my favorite things to say to students is, you don't get to have your cake of negativity and eat it. Like, you have to give some ground somewhere. Like, you don't get to just be this full pessimist where logically incompatible bad things are both true simultaneously. Like, you don't get to do that. So yeah, I like the raise here. I think this hand is thin but fine. And if you did have a jack here, I think the jack 8 point is such a ridiculously bad hand not to raise. Like, if you do just call with jack 8 here, I think you blunder so much EV that it's a huge epidemic. But this is what the Fortress is all about, guys. This is happening en masse. Like, students are mainly calling with jack 8 here. The people that are in our Discord group that we would be teaching on a regular basis are mainly calling with jack 8 here, even though it's a pure raise in theory for good reason and an EV loss to call. And in practice, it's even more the case. Jack 8 might be 96% equity here, you know, if ace 10 is 88 or 89%.
But not just students, even like really good players as well. Like, I can be playing guys who are probably professional at 500 NL, and I expect to still see a call from a jack a ton here.
Yeah, there's certain leaks that pros just get into the habit of having early on, and they just don't happen to discover it. They're just not working on that particular part of their game, so they never really find it. You know, absolutely. I think making the Carrot Poker School for me illuminated like many of the things that people were doing wrong, you know, years gone by, stuff that I was doing wrong. I was just like, wow, this spot is just so nuanced. There's so many specific factors in a spot like this that just make ranges so much weaker and wider than normal and make us need to adjust our thresholds. Okay, so here's a hand I haven't seen at all. This is the other one you brought for today, so let's see what happens here. Ace King off, we're in the big blind. We 3-bet, which is normal. Villain calls. 9-6 deuce, we go for a small bet here. Yeah, I think you could build different sizes here. Some people would go big, some people would go small. You could also check. Villain calls, the 4 of spades turn. We check with Ace King. Villain bets, we call. And on the river, yeah, not a clear decision to me at all. So I think the river's really interesting. I think we could say something about other streets as well, though. So where do you want to start the discussion with this hand?
Yeah, let's start at the flop, because this is a hand from when I was first going pro, and I obviously had a strategy where I'd be betting small on, you know, a third pot on this board. This is a board where in the world of solvers, you're probably not allowed to bet small. This would big bet only. Even if we're betting super frequently, you could probably range bet this for, you know, 60% pot and be fine. So I definitely had a strategy back then where I was betting small more, and I think in terms of strategy building, you can build strategies where you bet small. But also there might have been, I was very exploitative back then, maybe I'm a little bit less so now, but there might have been a little bit of, I kind of already know what's going to happen in this hand, and I kind of want to bet small to keep your range wide, because there's a lot of good things that can happen for you on later streets if your range is a little bit wider. Whereas if we go pot here, and then we check the turn and face the bet, immediately Ace King probably just becomes a mandatory fold against the pool.
Yeah, so this is like the analogy of like we're throwing the tennis ball up into the air before we can actually serve it. Like, we want to serve that ace, but sometimes we have to manipulate the ball into the right place first, i.e. get the opponent's range into a certain uncomfortable place where they're likely to play in an unbalanced and exploitable way later on. So yeah, I'm a big believer in stuff like that. Out of interest, why would you say that you're less exploitative and a bit more theoretical these days? Was it the case that you just went a bit far and had to come back to center a little bit, or was something changed in your ethos about the game?
Yeah, I think I've just got more understanding of the game. I think as your understanding of the game grows, you can just be a bit closer to theory. And then the old analogy of, it's not even an analogy, but the kind of, you need to learn the GTO baseline and then deviate when you want to exploit. I always kind of hated that, because you had to learn the GTO baseline, and learning the GTO baseline, like, it's just not something that anybody's capable of doing. You know, I'm sure Linus is blundering all, you know, kind of all over the place. It's just not a realistic thing for a human to be able to do. But I think like now I've kind of in all spots kind of built pretty resilient strategies that effectively are close enough to a GTO solution that they're kind of not massively exploitable. And then I can kind of move out of my base of operations from there. Whereas back here, I just don't think I was I kind of had that knowledge. So my strategies were a bit more kind of basic. And yeah, I think that this sort of thing, like, a lot of people would look at this and just go, this is a bad bet size. But the truth is, if the bet size is bad, like, how do you actually exploit that? Like, is this actually going to lose your NEV? Like, what's the mistake? There isn't anything you can really do against a bad bet size. And if it kind of induces mistakes, I think it's kind of good to give people the green light. You're allowed to be creative. You're allowed to do things that aren't necessarily GTO approved, but also don't really, if you look at the solutions, if you built a small bet strategy in this board, you wouldn't actually lose an EV if you played it well. So I think it's good to give people the kind of green light to do things that aren't bad, but maybe aren't solver approved.
Yeah, so I think it's cool to understand like why the solver lands on the big strategy here through its algorithm and all of that, which is to do with the nut advantage and the caliber of the hands that you're betting and their investment ceiling and their equity. But it's also really good to say, well, what would the EV be if I was to lock the solver to bet small? And as you say, there's no EV loss when you do that in spots like this. And then you can sort of open up the can of worms, and you can say, well, okay, well, if I do bet small, what kinds of branches later on in the tree are they going to be able to mess up on? Do those still exist if I bet big? What's the initial reaction to each sizing? Which is easier for them to play against? And you can pick a strategy that's a sideline strategy. We use this term in grade 3 of the Carrot Poker School. It's like in chess, if you're playing the Sicilian dragon, you don't want to play the main line of the dragon as white because you don't want to be drawn into all of that theory. Then you might play a different system. You might play I keep forgetting all the names. You might play the C3 Sicilian, the Alipin, or you might play the Rosalimo, you might play something else. And that might be slightly worse objectively. Like you might be getting a bit of a worse position out of it, like by a tenth of a pawn or something like that. But if you know that and your opponent doesn't, then you are actually anticipating gains somewhere along the way in that branch. So I think here when you bet small, if you want to make that your strategy here and you want to craft that out and you want to say, well, I'm doing this because I think on the turn people are going to have too wide of a range. They won't be able to, if they do bet the turn, they then won't be able to control their river bluff frequency because they're going to have way too many floats on the flop that they're going to have to give up many of on the river. Then it does make sense to actually lead them down that garden path and say, well, I dare you to actually play your range properly now. Whereas if you big bet and then check the turn, as you say, it's kind of hard for them to make a mistake with that range that they land there with. So I think that's an excellent point that you made. Okay, so we check the turn, which seems pretty standard. I think if we had, with Ace of Spades, I know that we can turn hands into bluffs a bit further up into the showdown value. I don't think we get to go as high up as Ace King here, though, unless there's some weird block bet line here where this like is multi-purpose, but I wouldn't think so. I'd think this is just a check. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. I think after betting the flop small, you can definitely make excuses for bluffing the turn aggressively. You know, if you've just got queen high, jack high, you might want to just find an excuse to bluff because, I mean, I don't know the exact frequency, but I suspect against the block bet, imposition's only really allowed to fold about 10% of the time. And so the range is just going to be super wide and you could just challenge the guy to say, you know, I just challenge you to find enough calls on the turn in the river. But yeah, like Ace King, especially after going small, the guy's going to have... Suspects that the Ace King would, if it is betting, it's like a hybrid, right? Like you're going to get called by like Ace Queen, Ace Jack sometimes, some spades. And I think you could go down that, but if you want to play a much more simple strategy, then just pure checking Ace King. Even if you think it's a mix, it just makes a ton of sense.
Yep, I think so. And it would be in earlier positions and stuff like that, where Ace King is actually lower down in your range, where you would say, well, with the Ace of Spades, this hand is now folding out enough pocket pairs in the earlier configuration, the tight range battle, that now this is a good hand to actually turn into a bluff. But here, I think it's just too strong for that, especially when you're the big blind and you have so many like low showdown value hands that your range can be bluffing. It would be really easy to overbluff dramatically here, and I don't know that that's fine, as you say, when you have like Queen Jack and it may be an overfolded spot, but it would be really hard to think that the bet EV is better than the check EV here with Ace King on this node. So yeah, I like the check call. The check call seems pretty good. Interesting spot though. Like I wonder how much fold equity there is with jam here, like compared to what there's meant to be just against pool. Any thoughts on whether you would deviate to jam? I don't think it would jam here in theory, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, there is a bit of jam with like Ace King, Ace Queen in a lot of these spots, and it is an interesting. I've been kind of looking at it a little bit recently, and it's quite a complicated spot. I think it's definitely one of the spots that I encourage people to kind of build a strategy in. I think most people don't really check raise the turn that much. They don't do it with value, they don't do it with bluffs, and it's just a really good thing to do, especially against people who stab too much. Even if people just stab optimally, you'll notice that the solver might be check jamming like 20% of the time or so in a spot like this. Like it's just a really important part of theory that is interesting and definitely worth building into people's games. If I look at the calling range versus the check jam, or the kind of call fold threshold, I think people probably call a little bit too much with flush draws. I was talking to some people. I think it's kind of hard to, maybe different people play differently, but there's a lot of spots where you're supposed to fold an ace-high flush draw, and I think a lot of people look at it and go, I've got a flush draw and I beat the bluffs. So I think it might be a spot where people don't really mess up that much. It's, you know, that they might overfold a few hands and overdefend some other hands. So I'm not sure if there's that much in terms of exploiting. Maybe, I think there's definitely scope to exploit individual players. In position, some people will just stab a ton in this spot, and some people just, you know, will bet a really, really polarized range. So some guys you'll see betting like a hand like 6-7 or pocket eights here, and other guys just won't be betting unless they think they can bet the river for value as well. So if you got some guy who you think stabbing too much, then absolutely check jamming makes a ton of sense. Yep. Especially after we've kind of kept the range wide on the flop. Against other guys, it's probably going to be a little bit disastrous.
Yeah, and I think when you have the Ace of Spades, it actually makes you not want to do that, because you want to get bet called by Ace-X of Spades here, right? So you actually want to unblock
you want the guy
that.
to bet call Ace Queen of Spades or Ace Jack of Spades or something.
Even if Ace Queen's meant to check back, there could be like Ace 10 of Spades that's still meant to call off in this node and stuff, because you're jamming like the King Jacks and stuff. Now that might get close depending on exactly the showdown value of the hand. Right, let's look at river. So we do call here. River is the 3 of Spades. Any thoughts on this node here?
Yeah, I think, like I say, going back to the flop, if you think about what the guy's calling range on the flop is, it's going to be like, there's a lot of hands that are just 2-overs with a backdoor. So Queen Jack clubs, Queen Jack diamonds, and all the other kind of 2-over cards with backdoors. So the guy's range is pretty wide from the flop. A lot of them are going to be barreling, kind of betting on the turn. They're breaking the turn and the river. Obviously, the guy's going to have some flushes, but a lot of the floats are going to bet the turn. And on a 4 straight 3 flush river, they kind of feels incentivized to barrel. I think finding the value threshold can be quite hard. I don't know what the value threshold is for imposition, but it can get quite complicated on these flush close rivers. If this isn't a spade, I think it's going to be very, very different. But quite often in these spots, a 9, even some kind of fairly marginal 9s will be a jam. Like I said, I don't know exactly what the value threshold is in this spot, but if we think that in general people kind of miss the thinnest value, then that means their bluff allowance isn't quite as high. And I think the guy's range is just super, super wide. There's just an absolute ton of bluff candidates. And I'm sure you mentioned this in some of your courses. I think whether someone's over bluffing or under bluffing is really going to depend on their river landing range.
Yeah.
If your landing range just has a ton of air in it, it's going to be really, really hard to control that frequency. And if your landing range doesn't have any air in it, it's going to be really, really hard to over bluff.
Yep.
And this is just a spot where I think the guy's river landing range has a ton of air and not that much value. It's kind of hard to find the value bets beyond the flushes.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a spot where maybe your strategy on the turn should be to jam most overpairs and most draws that don't have a lot of showdown value. So I really do think that the only flushes we really get here with are things that destroy the deck, like ace 9 of spades, but then also things like ace king of spades and ace queen of spades. I think if you have like king queen of spades here, you just have to jam the turn, or ace 5 of spades here, you probably have to jam the turn in GTO. And so villain is probably meant to go way, way wider here than it looks like, and you probably are meant to call like quite a lot of your ace king combos to the river jam because of that. Most of the kings, queens, jacks is just basically gone from your range because it would either bet the turn or check jam. So I wouldn't even be shocked in this spot if villain was meant to go for value with hands like pocket 10s and pocket jacks and stuff like that. And I really do think people are going to miss that on this run out a lot of the time. Sure, the better players might find it, but I'd be really surprised to see villain jam jacks on you in this spot. And so I do think that, as you say, that just shrinks the value region. It means the bluff to value ratio is harder to achieve. And yeah, as you say, it's a really good point. How are people to possibly control their bluff frequency here? They don't have a lot of offsuit hands. They're not going to have that many spade blocker bluff hands that they can bet with. So they're going to land here with a whole lot of like king, queen, king, jack, jack 10 combos, 2 clubs, 2 diamonds, that sort of thing. And they're not going to have a 5 or a flush all that often, especially when you have the ace of spades. So yeah, this looks like an overbluff spot to me. And you have the ideal bluff catcher anyway, I would think, because there's not a whole lot of offsuit bluffs containing the ace of spades in villain's range here, but there are plenty of suited spade hands that are the value bet. So call looks hugely winning here to me. It looks really good. Yeah,
it's kind of a shame that we have the ace of spades. It's obviously really good for the hand, in the hand, but
you want to look like more of a hero, right?
Exactly.
You want to look like
I think the way that I played the hand, I think it's pretty clear after the small bet on the flop and the check call on the turn. I think it's kind of clear that I'm playing on just calling down on a lot of rivers. If the river's like a queen or a jack, it just connects really well with his bluffing range. So things might be different in that spot. I might not be calling so much, but in this spot, it kind of looks like I kind of pre-planned it almost from the flop. So the fact that I've got the ace of spades isn't like, the deciding factor. If we had ace king of hearts here, I think I'd be calling still.
Yep. And I think hands like 6-5 and 4-5 are very infrequently going to bet half pot on the turn as well. So I almost like that the river's a 3 here because it's going to cause villain to value bet too thinly for some reason. And it's also just going to be not a river that makes very many straights. There'll be some ace 5 suited, sure, but like not tons. So I think when it's 4 straight on the river, and your opponent doesn't have a lot of straights, but they go all in, for example, that's very often an overbluff node because the 4 straight or whatever stops them value betting as thinly, but doesn't deter them from bluffing necessarily. It's easy to look at this as button and say, man, this is a good run out for my range, quote unquote, range advantage, the 4 straight, blah, 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 as the pre-flop caller for the 3-bet. So yeah, I really like the way you played this hand and the way you thought about it. You said before we recorded that you weren't sure you played this one well, but I'm actually behind it on all streets, I think.
Yeah, not that I didn't play it well. I like the way that I played it. I didn't play it well from a game theory point of view. The kind of small flop size was the main thing that if you run it through a solver, it'll tell you off, but you can ignore the solver in that instance.
You can ignore the solver in lots of instances. Well, James, it's been really fun having you on. I'd love to have you on again and discuss more hands. I actually really like the way that we have the sort of the to and fro there with hand review. I think it'll be really watchable. The Fortress is going to be amazing. I'm really pumped about it. I'm really looking forward to this course. And just to show everyone the outline one more time, clicking this button will take you to a payment place where you can actually get the link to the Discord group to join the server. And James is going to be taking questions in there between classes. It's going to be awesome. I don't think we've done anything like this before where we actually say, here are places where your strategy is almost certainly bad. We can almost like preemptively diagnose where they are, and we can fix them for you. This is like diagnostics, like the database reviews that you've been doing for our guys, and fixes all rolled into one. And I think the live seminar format's great as well, because people can sort of throw questions to you and stuff like that. So yeah, head over to carrotcorner.com, guys, to sign up for that and for all of our other products, and we will get James Shea back on the show at some time in the near future to talk a bit more about how he's achieved what he's achieved in poker and his ethos to coaching, and review some more hands. So thanks again, James. That was awesome.
Cool. Thanks for having me, Pete.
All right, guys, we'll see you later. Don't forget to hit the like button if you like this video. Do let us know what you think. We'll be back soon. Take care.